So unless you've been living underneath an investor's rock, you've never watched my channel before, you've never visited Fidelity's website before, you've never watched YouTube before, then you probably already know about Fidelity ZERO Index Funds. And while they're still definitely unique, with no other index funds out there really having zero expense ratios, the question still remains, even if you never said it out loud. Should you invest in Fidelity ZERO Index Funds? Are they actually worth it? In this video, I promise you to give you the very best, most comprehensive video on YouTube right now regarding Fidelity Zero Expense Ratio Index Funds. We're going to talk about each of the 4 different Fidelity Zero funds. We're going to break down what their holdings look like. We're going to compare them to the actual funds that have expense ratios with Fidelity. And we're going to see, based on their price history and their dividends and the different characteristics between them, do they actually outperform the Fidelity Index Funds that have an expense ratio? So we are pitting Fidelity's index funds against each other. Fidelity Zero versus Fidelity Indexed Mutual Funds. It's an all-out Fidelity civil war here. Not sure if that was PC to say or not, but regardless, it happened, and we'll see how many dislikes this video gets. Let's get started. Hey guys, before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button below the video to ensure you do not miss any future videos I post. Make sure to leave a comment below saying you subscribed, and I promise to respond personally to your comment. Alright guys, you know how much I value your time and I never want to waste it, so let's jump right into the content here. We're talking Fidelity Zero versus Fidelity Indexed Mutual Funds, and there are 4 different Fidelity Zero Indexed Mutual Funds. We have the Fidelity Zero Total Market Index Fund, FZROX. We have the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Index Fund, FNILX, the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund, FZIPX, and then lastly we have the Fidelity Zero International Index Fund, FZILX. All right, let's go ahead and start right off the bat here with the Fidelity Zero Total Market Index Fund. All right, we got them both up here. We've got the Fidelity Zero and then its counterpart, the Total Market Index Fund, FSKAX. So these funds are very similar to each other. So they both attempt to track the total market, but they do it in different ways. And so let's talk a little bit how these funds are different from each other. One of the biggest things I want to call out between the Fidelity Zero and the Fidelity Total Market Index Fund is their holdings. So we've got the Fidelity Zero on the left and the Fidelity Total Market on the right. You can see here that the top 10 holdings and the top 10 percentage of total assets is exactly the same. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, Alphabet Class A, Alphabet Class C, which is Google, Berkshire Hathaway, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan Chase, exactly the same. But if you look below that, you can see here that the number of holdings in the index fund are pretty significantly different. In the Fidelity Zero Fund, we have 2,442 different holdings, and in the Fidelity Total Market Fund, we have 3,532 holdings. So over 1,000 more stocks in the Total Market Fund versus the Fidelity Zero. One thing you can take away right away is that the Fidelity Total Market Fund, not the Zero, the Total Market Fund, has a more diversification in it, more holdings. But then the question then follows naturally, which is, does that change the performance of the fund? We can see here that year to date, the Fidelity Zero Fund is lagging the Total Market Index Fund from 5.56% to 5.78%. Not a significant difference there though. The 1-year returns are almost the same as well. 20.28% for the Fidelity Zero, 20.54% for the Total Market Index Fund. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any additional information for the Fidelity Zero except its lifetime return. You can see here the Fidelity Zero was created August 2nd, 2018, whereas the Total Market Fund here, 11/5 of 1997. The expense ratio, just to be clear here, obviously with Fidelity Zero, it's a 0% expense ratio. For the total market though, it's only 0.015%. And you should know that that had really no impact in the difference between the performance here. It's essentially zero. It's $1.50 for every 10,000 you invest. If you had $1 million invested in this fund, which that'd be a lot, the total fee for the year is $150. So it's not a really significant difference. Now what I wanted to do is take the actual price data, since there's not a significant amount, take the actual price data for both of these index funds, take into account the actual dividends paid since the Fidelity Zero Fund was created, and see how they would have performed exactly along the same time frames. All right, here's the Fidelity Zero Total Market Fund. You can see here we're assuming a contribution every month of $100, and I assume the same thing for the other fund. And we've also got dividends paid here, and we're assuming that dividends were reinvested through this whole time. Now, Fidelity Zero pays an annual dividend in December, whereas with the Total Market Fund, it pays semi-annually in April and December. So we'll see if that had any real impact. So for that time frame from September of 2018 to February of 2021, assuming $100 a month contribution, dividends paid is the actual amounts that were paid, and based on the closing price for every month, we can see here that for the Fidelity Zero Total Market Fund, we ended up with $4,047.12, owning 284 shares. Then let's look over here at the Fidelity Total Market Index Fund. Same metrics except for different dividends, different price, but the same contributions. Assuming reinvested dividends we see here, we end up with $4,058.77. So $40.58.77, $40.47.12. It's an $11 difference here. I'm not sure if that probably comes from the dividend frequency or not, but the truth is they're almost essentially exactly the same. If you want more diversification, you can go with the Fidelity Total Market Index Fund, even though it's got a very small expense ratio. But if you're really all about owning the zero funds, then by all means, you can own it. They're essentially the same. You can go either way here. All right, next up here, we're gonna talk about the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Index Fund, FNILX. And one of the first things I want to talk about here is we have two different index funds we're comparing it to. We're comparing it to the Fidelity S&P 500 Index Fund, FZIPX, but we're also going to compare it against the Fidelity SAI US Large Cap Index Fund, FLCPX. The Fidelity S&P 500 Fund only tracks those that are in the S&P 500, those 500 holdings, actually technically 505. But with the US Large Cap Index, we might see a variance between the underlying holdings, so we wanted to include them as well. Although you're going to see there's a lot of similarities between these three different index funds. Let's dive in. All right, so first thing we're going to look at here, the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Fund, of course, has a 0% expense ratio. Fund was created September 13th of 2018. The Fidelity 500 Fund has an expense ratio that's really small, again, 0.015%. It was created in 1988. And the Fidelity Large Cap Fund has an expense ratio of 0.018%, very similar and also very low. The differences you're going to see between these funds based on the expense ratio is going to be very negligible. So for the Fidelity Zero Fund, for the top 10 holdings, they make up 26.54% of the total assets in the portfolio, whereas with the Fidelity 500 Fund, it's actually higher, 27.34% of the total portfolio. And for the Fidelity Large Cap, FLCPX, we've also got it higher, 27.26% of the total portfolio. Now, for the Fidelity Zero Fund, we have 516 holdings right here as of December 31st. For the Fidelity 500, it has 508 holdings. And then for the Fidelity Large Cap Fund, we've got 507 holdings. And you're also going to notice here that the top 10 holdings are exactly the same across all three funds. We're going to have Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Tesla, Alphabet Class A, Class C, Berkshire Hathaway, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan Chase, all very similar holdings. All right, let's talk about performance here. For the Fidelity Zero Fund, year to date, it's up 4.31%, and the 1 year return is 19.66%. For the 500 Fund, we've got year to date 4.23%. Very similar. 1 year return 17.24 for the Fidelity S&P 500. So it lagged the Fidelity Zero Fund. And the reason why that is because the Fidelity Large Cap Fund was able to carry Tesla before the Fidelity S&P 500 Fund. Because with the Fidelity S&P 500, you can't carry stocks that are not in the index, and it was not officially, Tesla was not officially added to the S&P 500 until I think November, December. So that explains the 1 year return having a variance there. Interestingly enough, the Fidelity Large Cap Index Fund lagged the Fidelity Zero Fund for the 1 year return as well. But as you can see here, the year-to-date returns are almost exactly the same. 4.31 for the Zero, 4.23 for the large cap, and then for the Fidelity 500, 4.23. So then the question becomes, if we were to apply a $100 contribution to each of these three index funds, how would they actually perform given the different distribution frequencies for the dividends? As you can see here, the Fidelity Zero Fund pays an annual dividend in December. The S&P 500 pays a quarterly distribution, and the Fidelity Large Cap Index Fund pays a semi-annual distribution in September and December. So given those numbers being very similar, the year-to-date, the 1 year return, how does the actual performance play out when we actually put into the Excel spreadsheet the price history and the actual dividends paid? The Fidelity Zero Fund ended, as you can see here, with a portfolio value of $3,875.14 from, again, September of 18 through February of 2021. S&P 500 Index Fund ended with $37.98.01. So that was lower than the Fidelity Zero Fund. And then the large cap we come down here to the bottom, we can see here that the return 37.96. So both 37.96 for the large cap and 37.98, almost exactly the same, underperformed the Fidelity Zero Fund, 38.75. But then again, as we talked about year to date, the funds are exactly the same. So at this point, I can tell you with pretty strong confidence it doesn't matter which of these three that you invest in. If you like having a zero expense ratio index fund, then by all means, own the Fidelity Zero Large Cap Fund. But the results are very close here. You could choose any of these three funds and be successful. All right, next up, we need to talk about the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund, FZIPX. Now this fund compares most closely with the Fidelity Extended Market Index Fund, FSMAX. And right off the bat, I need to share with you that the indexes that both of these index funds follow is different. They're similar, but not the same, and that's gonna explain why there were some significant historical differences and potentially some return differences. So if we take a look here at the strategy differences here, you can see Fidelity Zero here on the left talks about investing in the Fidelity US Extended Investable Market Index, which is a float adjusted market cap weighted index designed to reflect the performance of United States, US mid and small cap stocks. Mid and small cap stocks are considered to be stocks of the top 2,500 US companies, excluding the largest 500 companies. So you would expect to see around 2,000 different stocks in this index fund, excluding those in the S&P 500. If we look over here for FS Max, we can see that this fund tracks a different index. It tracks the Dow Jones US Completion Total Stock Market, which represents the performance of stocks of mid to small cap US companies. So this one here represents the top 2,500 minus the top 500, whereas this one here is the total stock market minus, as you can see here, excluding components of the S&P 500. So the question is, in this total completion stock market, there might be more than 2,500 holdings, and in fact, you'll see that here. So given that information, let's take a look at the top holdings here. We can see for the Fidelity Zero Fund, there are 1,928 holdings, which again is approximately the top 2,500 minus the top 500. Whereas over here on the right side, you can see that there are 3,218 holdings. So it's a much more significant level of diversification. 1928 versus 3218, over 1,200 more holdings in FSMAX. The top 10 holdings in the Zero Fund make up 5.81% of the portfolio, whereas it's 7.64% for the FSMAX fund. And you can see the holdings are relatively similar, but not necessarily exactly the same. We've got Square Inc., Uber, Zoom, Twilio, Snap, NXP Semiconductors, Blackstone, Workday, DocuSign, and Lululemon. And you can see here on the left side, they're pretty much not the same. Except for Zoom, video communications being in both of these funds, the top 10 are significantly different here. Very interesting. So given this difference in the holdings, the top 10, there's gotta be a significant difference in the overall performance for these funds. Let's take a look at the performance. The Fidelity Zero Fund is up year to date 12.93%, the 1-year return 23.33%. And for the Fidelity Extended Market Index Fund, you'll notice year to date, it's almost exactly the same, 13.01%. But the 1-year return is significantly higher, 36.67% compared to 23.33%. And by the way, you should know the Fidelity Extended Market Index Fund, you can see the expense ratio right here, 0.036%. Why on earth is there such a significant difference in the performance between these two index funds? The reason why FS Max outperformed on the 1-year return is because they had Tesla in the portfolio, and Tesla became throughout the year a much more significant holding in that portfolio, at one point holding over 5%. Now from there, we know that Tesla was added to the S&P 500, and when that happened, it was removed from FSMAX, which is why their performance is more in line with what we see with the Fidelity Zero Fund year to date. You'll notice here a difference in the distribution schedule with the Fidelity Zero Fund. It again paid dividends out annually in December, whereas with the Fidelity Extended Market Fund, it pays out semi-annual dividends in April and December. If we were able to factor in all the price information from September of 2018 through February of 2021 for both of these funds, we would see here, let's take a look at the actual performance. We've got for FZIPX, the Zero Extended Market Index Fund, assuming again a $100 monthly contribution, the actual dividends paid and being reinvested for this fund, we can see here, the total is $4,128.29. And for the FSMAX, 4128 versus 44.59, a product of that overperformance on the 1-year return, where Tesla was a significant holding in this fund. No longer though, because Tesla's part of the S&P 500. So again, we have some differences in the past, but year to date, about the same. If you want more diversification, you want more holdings, you can definitely own FSMAX, because it's got a much more significant holdings. However, if you're really wanting that Fidelity Zero Expense Ratio fund, then you can definitely own instead FZIPX, the Fidelity Zero Extended Market Index Fund. But again, you can't go wrong with either one of these two different funds. All right, lastly, I want to talk about the Fidelity Zero International Index Fund, FZILX. All right, so first thing you need to know here, the Fidelity Zero International Index Fund has two funds that it's very similar to. First off, we have the Fidelity Total International Index Fund, FTIHX. And then we also have the Fidelity Global ex-US Index Fund, FSGGX. Looking at those two different funds, we can see here the first one has an expense ratio of 0.06%. And with this other one here, we've got 0.055%. So it's not a significant expense ratio, but it still is higher than the Fidelity Zero. Let's see if that impacts performance though. When we look at the number of holdings, you're gonna see one of these funds tracks very closely to the Fidelity Zero Fund, and the other kind of goes even further with additional diversification. If we scroll down here to the top 10 holdings, we've got 10.92% for the Fidelity Zero Fund, and 2,126 different holdings. This first one here though that it compares to, again, has 10.03% of the total portfolio's assets. However, the number of holdings is much higher, over double, 4,754 holdings as of December 31st. And if we look over here at the FSGGX, we will see here that the top 10 holdings make up 11.64% of the total portfolio assets, and there are 2,404 different holdings. All three of these are very similar. Obviously though, we've got the two that have very similar amounts of holdings. Let's take a look here at performance. For the Fidelity Zero Fund, we've got 6.33% year to date versus 6.45% for FSGGX. And for the other one, 6.34%, almost exactly the same. The 1-year return for the Fidelity Zero is 14.79. That lags a little bit the Total International Index Fund at 15.04% for the 1 year. And then for FSGGX, 14.54%, which is almost par with the Fidelity Zero Fund. You'll notice here that all three of these different funds, the Fidelity Zero pays dividends annually in December, same with FTIHX in December annually, and then with FSGGX also December annually. So if we take all the numbers here for the price history, how do we actually compare here? So for the Fidelity Zero Index Fund, after that time frame from September of 2018 through February of 2021, assuming $100 a month in contributions and reinvesting dividends, we would have $3,830.45, as you can see right here. For FTIHX, we would have $3,829, so $38.29 versus $38.30, almost exactly the same. And then FSGGX, we have a total of $38.17. So all three of these very similar, same in their holdings for the most part, same in their top 10 of the assets, again, all market cap weighted. The top 10 holdings make up the most significant portion of the assets. And then given the fact that they all have annual distribution schedules, that's why there's very little differences between these three. You can own any of the three. So if you want to own the Fidelity Zero International Index Fund because it's got that zero expense ratio, then by all means do it. But you're not losing a lot. You're essentially getting the exact same investment with either the Fidelity Total International Index Fund, FTIHX, or the Fidelity Global ex-US Index Fund, FSGGX. So essentially what we found here, guys, is that you can totally own Fidelity Zero Index Funds and succeed. There's no lack of performance with these funds, even though in some cases maybe they undercut the number of holdings and you get maybe a little bit less diversification than you thought you were getting. It doesn't change the numbers, the actual performance. Even the dividend distribution history doesn't seem to have a significant impact on the overall results. So hopefully that encourages you. Jump in, utilize these funds if you're scared of using them, but if you're concerned about using a zero expense ratio, know that you're not leaving a lot on the table by owning any of the regular Fidelity indexed mutual funds. Make sure to leave your 2 cents in the comments below, guys. Let me know your feedback on this video. Let me know what more videos you want to see from about Fidelity Index Funds or any other types of investing topics you want to learn more about, because I want to make videos that you guys want to watch, not ones that I want to watch. I'm not the audience. That's all I got for you guys today. Have a great rest of your day, and please continue to stay healthy, both physically and financially. Have a good one.